Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thank you so much for joining us for today's live stream. You can also watch this. We'll have this on our YouTube channel later on. I just want to quickly introduce myself, and then I'm going to kick it over to my colleague from All Tech is Human, Sandra Khalil, who's going to be moderating this very timely conversation around tech facilitated and enabled gender-based violence. Here at All Tech is Human, we're a nonprofit based in New York with a global audience. For example, we have 8,000 people, 90 countries on our Slack, which is entirely free if you want to join or apply to join. All Tech is Human. What we're focused on is working together to solve tech and society's thorniest issues. And what I mean by that is, in order to solve these complex problems, we need to bring people together across civil society, government, industry, and academia. And that allows us to surface the tensions, the trade offs, the values, and the best practices. What we're trying to do here at All Tech is Human, and you can find out more at alltechishuman.org, is we create the systematic change through three parts, and that's our multi-stakeholder convening and community building. So last year we did 23 in-person gatherings all over the country in New York, DC, San Francisco, and London. We're looking to expand elsewhere. We also have community groups that are doing their independently organized gatherings all throughout the globe. So reach out our way if you're interested to do that. We also have this education. Currently, anybody watching, you can join one of our 6 working groups. We have an education working group, and then our 5 key areas that you can see up on our website, like trust and safety, youth tech, well-being, public interest technology, cyber, and democracy, and more. And then lastly, what we're focused on is diversifying the traditional tech pipeline with more backgrounds, disciplines, and lived experiences. And that's why we have our Responsible Tech Guide, our Responsible Tech Job Board, and over 6,000 people on our talent pool. So without further ado, I just want to bring up my colleague, Sandra, who's really going to be running the show. So Sandra, how's everything going? How's your day going?
Good. I'm so excited to moderate this great panel.
This is an incredible conversation. I know that we'll have today, but I also want to mention that we're now doing, and you're doing a lot of them, the weekly live stream series. What we found is in-person gatherings are great, but we have people, like I mentioned, 90 countries, over 100 countries in our newsletter. So we have a very global audience, and we're always looking to incorporate more and more voices from all different backgrounds and perspectives. So anybody watching, if you have a live stream suggestion, please let us know, and please use the chat to kind of share where you're at, right? And where we're coming from, because we're always looking that we need to connect other people to solve these hard problems. So I know that's a lot right there. So Sandra, really appreciate you and everything that you do at All Tech is Human around our partnerships, and then also the trust and safety lead. We're doing a lot of work there, which obviously dovetails with today's conversation. So do reach out my way, and then also with Sandra. Stay in touch at alltechishuman.org. We'd love to see what we can do. And if you have that live stream suggestion or other suggestions for All Tech is Human, reach out my way, and then for everybody else on our team. So I know I'll be jumping off stage. So really good luck with today's conversation. And I know it's a really important, timely topic. So really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, David. I am so excited to moderate this great discussion today, especially on the heels of International Women's Day and CSW soon at the UN here in New York. So looking forward to bringing on these panelists and getting the conversation started. So I have the distinct honor of introducing our panel today. Joining us today is Hera Hussain, founder and CEO of CHAYN. CHAYN is a global nonprofit that creates resources on the web to address gender-based violence. They have multilingual resources designed with and not for survivors, but with them to reach an audience of more than 500,000 people around the world. Next to her is Nakshathra Suresh, co-founder of eiris and All Tech is Human affiliate based in Australia. She is a cyber safety researcher and speaker who has presented at various conferences and fora, both in Australia and overseas. Finally, we have Sudeshna Mukherjee, policy communications consultant around technology, ethics, and human rights. Sudeshna is an independent consultant. She leverages decades plus of experience in topics like gender equality, child rights, and sustainable development to drive strategic partnerships and communications at the intersection of ethical tech. So thank you so much, panel, for joining us on the current state of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. Um, Nakshatra, I'll start with you, sort of drawing from your experience in cyber safety with Iris. Could you share insights on recent examples of technology both perpetrating and combating gender-based violence online? What have you been seeing recently?
Sure. So I see both the combating and the perpetrating, and I see them in very, very distinct sort of tunnels, and they don't intersect. So one side doesn't see the other. But one thing I did come across recently, which I thought was very interesting, but was someone using AI to Photoshop smiles on women's faces because they wanted to see women smiling more. And this was very common on dating apps, I believe, people taking screenshots of women that had posted their photos on dating applications and then modifying those images using AI and sending it back to them saying, hey, you look pretty with a smile on. And that's something that while previously we probably wouldn't have thought that was an opportunity to do on dating apps, the fact that it has happened and people just use it as a way to have conversation now is horrifying. And the fact that someone can take my image or your image or anyone else's image on this live stream, modify it for their own purpose because they feel entitled to that image is very scary. On the other hand, being in the startup space, I do see a lot of very innovative solutions to combat gender-based violence. So I have seen a number of solutions that are being put out there regarding assisting content moderators and trust and safety teams and streamlining their line of work. Another thing that we are trying to do at Iris as well is upskill everyone's digital literacy and allow for more tangible, inclusive, and intersectional education across the board. So that is another innovative solution that I would probably say is required in this state. And one thing, again, is with technology, there is no jurisdiction. So the difficulties that we encounter with having any type of innovation is that we might be I would say limited by the way that we're located. So I'm obviously in Australia. There's very limited access that I have to innovate, but being connected to a variety of different support services and other founders and other organizations across the world has allowed me to innovate further and think outside just the Australian or the Asia Pacific sphere. So I think that's really important for both understanding, combating, how to combat a problem that's occurring overseas that might eventually reach our soil as well, because again, it doesn't have any jurisdiction.
Yeah, and I think the jurisdictional issue, as well as legislation and punitive measures, is definitely a thread I want to pull on later on in the conversation. But this actually brings a really interesting point about the tech facilitated harm transitioning from an online space to the offline world. And Hera, if I could jump to you, bless you, if I could jump to you, um, how have you seen in your work with CHAYN the tech facilitated harm jumping from online to offline, and is there a way that we can measure this effectively, slash is it an ethical way of thinking to measure this to make the case that tech facilitated gender-based violence is real?
Yeah, great question. I also want to acknowledge that I will be sneezing at any moment in the next 2 minutes. So just forewarning everybody. Of course, it's going to happen when you ask me a question. But I think your question is really, really important. And I get asked this question actually a lot by people who are in the traditional sort of human rights and gender-based violence space. Because they feel like there's a very big distinction between what's online and what's offline, and I just do not think that exists anymore. There's a very, very thin line. It's very permeable. We don't live offline lives. Most of us will live lives of which online is a big part, and it's really hard to completely detach yourself from it. If you're not online, then your abuser might be online, the people that you're connected to might be online, and you're going to get targeted in those spaces. So I think that we should not talk about it like that. However, it is always interesting to see how abuse that is, again, in a very traditional spaces, people will often say things like, this person is experiencing domestic violence in a particular context, and then they kind of think that as soon as you can create distance, physical distance between the perpetrator and the victim or survivor, then that solved the issue. But it doesn't, because the distance online doesn't really exist that much. And this is why all the work that we're doing on trust and safety, on sort of legislation, on like culture change is so important, because with something like stalking, it's actually, it's using something that will used to be offline, but it is amplified and has such a bigger reach online. Similar thing with online harassment. Harassment per se is something that women have experienced, and non-binary people and gender minorities and sexual minorities have, and racialized people have experienced for a long time. But it's just the way that violence can now be sort of directed, and the volume of it, and the different ways and the nefarious ways it can come. That is what's like a major difference. And I think we need to acknowledge that, and also then work in including that in the way that we think about online safety, about internet culture, and all the different ways that our lives are so intertwined with tech.
Yeah, I agree that it's so important to have like a culturally sensitive set of norms that we can all ascribe to, in ensuring that, we protect these vulnerable populations online and ensure that they stay online, because it's not an answer for them to go offline. It's so important to make the case for that. And I know, Sudeshna, recently in Tech Policy Press, you wrote about this as it relates to women activists, and I would love if you recapped a little bit of your findings there.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sandra, and colleagues, for having me here today. As Sandra mentioned, I wrote about 4 women activists confronting tech-facilitated gender-based violence, and my key takeaways from that research, which I co-authored with another colleague, was like, one of the things was to update the existing laws. And we all heard about the Taylor Swift, deepfake issue, and close in heels, the California senators then proposed introducing the Defiance Act, which would actually be an amendment to the existing Violence Against Women Act, to hold creators and distributors of non-consensual deepfakes accountable. That happened on exactly the day the article came out, like 31st of Jan. And again, similarly, in India, it didn't really make the splash like a Taylor Swift news, but there was one Indian actress who had a similar experience, and Indian government, through its Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, then made it mandatory to take down deepfakes within 24 hours. So rules like that, and we didn't know, but it's not again widely publicized. But then China's cyberspace administration released the world's most extensive, comprehensive rather, deepfake regulation in January 23. So there are these local and national initiatives which are being taken, which we found like there's a whole section on regulatory frameworks. So having that amendment is very crucial. Then explicitly naming TFGBV in laws, for example, Shea Akiwowo, who's also featured in that article, she and her team have advocated for incorporation of women and girls in UK's first Online Safety Act. And again, her team has done this fantastic research on digital misogynoir, and it talks about how women, Black women in particular, experience harms online. So basically, evidence-based advocacy and then explicitly naming these harms can help in addressing these problems. Then centering survivor stories. Most of us, how many of us were aware of what is metaverse, what is augmented reality, virtual reality? But spotlighting cases like what Neena Jane Patel experienced in metaverse, and then raises awareness around these new kinds of harms, which us as non-digital natives, us growing up in the non-digital era, are now coming to see and experience. So it's very important to protect our future, both children and marginalized groups. So that's something we came across. Then strategic litigation. There are organizations like DataWo in Greece who are doing lawsuits to set legal precedents, which will criminalize image-based sexual abuse and violence and enforce quicker content removal, because the longer it stays on the net, we know about what it does. So those were some things. Hera has already talked about the online and offline bridging the gap. Nakshatra has talked about some of the things that she came across, like policymakers. So engaging policymakers again in advisory networks. UK has an online safety network. Creating those coalitions is very, very important. So those were some of the findings that I came across.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sudeshna. And I know it's really important to discuss making the penalties sufficiently punitive for the scope of the crime that happens online. I know, Nakshatra, you've done extensive research in that space. And one of our first discussions, I said, where were you when I was working in that space, concerned that our penal code did not address something like cyberstalking sufficiently to be punitive for the perpetrator. So Nakshatra, take me through that, and Sudeshna as well. What are we doing in terms of that kind of advocacy to lobby for legal frameworks and create precedents?
Thanks, Sandra. I recall our conversation, and I remember how passionate we both were, because we've both seen how limited it is in this space for any form of advocacy to happen, and the onus is often on the survivor to do that themselves, and that's a very harmful thing, to re-traumatize someone going through the criminal justice process again, and to have to advocate for themselves when the law, legislation, policy, government, and other bodies are not really helping them out in that regard. But for a little bit of background for all our viewers and our panelists as well, I did my thesis on stalking and cyberstalking in Australia, and one thing that I did discover was both bystander perceptions, but also victim perceptions of both stalking and cyberstalking. And one thing that I realized with, again, my criminology degree is that the law doesn't update itself unless there's enough conversation surrounding it through several bodies, right? And for the longest time, both in Australia and in the US, a lot of the legislation surrounding cyberstalking is state-based or territory-based. There is no federal law or legislation governing cyberstalking. So if you're a victim of cyberstalking in one state or one particular jurisdiction, and your stalker follows you across state lines, there's no intervention that law enforcement can do in that regard. And most of these cases don't qualify for federal intervention either, as a result of them being no legislation that covers that. The issue that I see here is that people place more of an emphasis, and Hera touched on this before, on offline stalking. And when you deal with any form of cyber abuse, that is inherently there, the spectrum is inherently gray. It's like there's a gray area. It's never just online. It's never just offline. It's both. They exist together. So one of the things that I've been trying to drive in many conversations that I have with people is that cyberstalking is incredibly gendered. And one of the things that we do need to focus on is how it disproportionately affects not only women, but women of color, women of other marginalized communities like LGBTQIA plus folks, Indigenous folks as well, disabled folks, people who are in the spotlight who have these other identities behind them as well, and they are advocates for this. But just because something happens online and they come public and forward with it, for example, Sudeshna mentioned Taylor Swift, but also the Indian actress that experienced the deepfake abuse. They are people in the public spotlight and their stories came to light, but there are average everyday folks also experiencing this as well. And just because their stories don't come out into the public spotlight doesn't mean that they deserve any less recognition or appropriate intervention. So one of the things that I think I would like to mention on this call is that this is amazing, having 4 women of color discuss the current state of technology facilitate and enable gender-based violence. And we need more of this. We need more of these conversations from academics, from experts, from founders, from journalists and independent consultants. We need all of these conversations to happen in a public eye, but also to translate these opinions and thought pieces into actual work that allows for tangible solutions for victim survivors of online gender-based violence.
Yeah, and it's so important to note that and name that no one solution is going to be a silver bullet here, which is why the multi-stakeholder coalescing around these issues kind of exposes how it's hydra-headed and shows that there's a division of labor needed, and every sector you mentioned has a role to play in addressing this harm. Hera, I think, talking about survivors, could you elaborate on the challenges that you've seen with CHAYN in survivors accessing their support services? Speaking from experience, I've seen it. There is a shame attached to seeking support services. There's a re-traumatization that Nakshathra mentioned to seek justice. How are you seeing this challenge of support services, and what kind of innovations are you implementing at CHAYN to circumvent that?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's we often say in Chen that there's there's no one form of healing. So that healing is a very personal journey for survivors. And what we found is that like you mentioned, there's shame. There's also feeling of guilt because sometimes the harassment that you're experiencing is having an impact on the people around you. Maybe it's your children, it's your family members, it's your colleagues. So there's the feeling of guilt as well. Oh no, because of me, this is happening. That guilt and shame playing into. There's anger. There's grief for the life that you can no longer live. If you're experiencing stalking, you can no longer go out and go about with your life. Even having something like your face on LinkedIn becomes like a thing. It starts affecting so many aspects of it, and just the feeling of safety, both emotional and physical. And what I find interesting is that often when we're talking about, in the trust and safety space especially, I find people often have very rigid views of what survivors are experiencing and what solutions will work for them. At CHAYN, we do not do that. We really think that survivors need a variety of options through which, for some, justice will look like, I need to just be able to feel safe online and be able to take a picture with my friends when I'm going out, and that's okay. That might just be what healing looks like for them. For others, healing might look like, no, there was, intimate images of me released. I lost my job because of it. I'm going to go to court and I'm going to take action against who did this to me. And I'm going to get my job back because that wasn't fair. And that's okay. And that's, and the systems in that case need to enable that form of justice for that survivor. We focus on helping people, with the sort of dealing with their trauma and healing from it. So that's sort of restorative care, all online, all free, through courses, guides, and also practical advice like how to stay safe online, how to collect evidence of what's happened to you. Those are the things that we've done because we think it's really important that the healing journey for survivors can be so isolating, and that you feel very alone in your experience. But the truth is, sadly, that survivors are not alone. There's so many of us everywhere. And if there's someone like CHAYN who can help them feel less alone and connect them to the different services, even things like in one of our courses, we talk about all the amazing work that's happening through activists on image-based abuse, for example, because it gives people a sense of hope, and hope is one of our trauma-informed design principles. And I think it's such an important thing. Is like, if we can give people hope to for a better present, for a better future, then that's like something that's like the innovation needed. But also, we write a lot about trauma-informed design. How can technologies be safer from the beginning? Or if you're dealing with harassment and abuse in real time, how can platforms, policies really help survivors by tackling that head on? How can we future proof such technologies? So yeah, we do a lot of work on the research side as well, and discuss how we as a tech producer ourselves are doing the same.
Yeah, and I like the way that you're framing, not putting the onus on the survivor to have everything figured out and how to protect themselves online, but also having an onus on the platform to provide a healthy digital space for them to exist in. That makes me think of the thread that we were pulling earlier on digital literacy and the digital divide. And Sudeshna, I know that there's sort of varied adoptions of digital literacy programming for reasons we can name in a whole other live stream. Have you seen successful strategies to help shift the societal attitudes around this kind of programming, around harassment, around exploitation, and take me through what that could look like in a global majority context?
Thanks so much, Sandra, for that. So I'm glad you mentioned in the beginning, most of technology is invented, developed in the global north, Western context, while its uptake by sheer numbers is in global majority. So digital literacy is the only way. At the same time, technology outpaces regulations. So by the time, it's just the nature of the beast, by the time you have a new technology, someone else would have come up with an idea for a harm, when technology could actually beautifully support us and make our lives easier. There's that harm part, which obviously the digital divide really exacerbates that. And through the research that we did, we found out that a multi-stakeholder partnership, alliance building, coalition building is the only way to approach. And so, for example, we came across like governments can integrate digital literacy in school curriculum, and Zimbabwe, for that matter, did a roundtable on online safety um, uh, for women and children, and it was a global it was a joint EU spotlight initiative. So there's been a lot of work with multilateral organizations. Then schools and universities can integrate digital literacy in their curriculum. So Indian government, for example, has a safe online campaign doing rounds. Then civil society groups have their own role to play. There, I love the work that Nikhar Tat, who also sits on the UN's advisory board for AI, has been doing through her organization, Digital Rights Foundation, and the other works of like public-private partnerships, Bumble in India, with a civil society organization, a think tank, Dialogue, came up with this framework. Or say Sri Lanka through Factum Code of Practice, has showcased the potential impact of such partnerships. At the same time, we cannot take away the responsibility of tech platforms, who are the inventors, who are the creators. How are they integrating? Should it be a reactive response or should it be proactive? It should be proactive. So integrating safety by design principles, integrating human rights impact assessments when you're creating digital or launching digital products and services, doing it beforehand instead of an afterthought is very, very important to ensure that. That's why the tech safety, the trust and safety teams are so crucial for tech. While in the US, we are reeling through all the tech layoffs. that also spotlights like how these key roles are going to help curb the harm. So how can so there's that stakeholder aspect of it, and at the same time, how do we truly shift societal attitude? Is important to note that there should be culturally relevant content. So if it's shares organization glitch or data woo in Greece, they contextualize how each of this how can TFGBV look in each of these contexts? So that's very important. Amplifying local voices. I already mentioned how new voices, like Nakshatra mentioned, why just a Taylor Swift or a Rashmika Mandana who are celebrities, who talks about people like the marginalized people who do not have a voice otherwise. So amplifying those voices is important. Engaging in more conservative contexts, where we saw through our research and interviewing Nighat again, we saw there's a different approach to take patriarchal social norms in countries which have, if we are talking about Iran or if we are talking about other places, we need to come up with localized solutions of TFGBV in such places. At the same time, having been a media and communication student, I saw how real life, challenges um, can be, expressed through reel. So entertainment, education is very important. Telenovelas, for instance, in Spain, in Latin America, have been very effective tool for raising awareness. So things like that, they can help shape attitudes. And digital literacy is more powerful when you see a representation of yourself on screen or through these talks. That's one good way. And then framing digital skills as an empowerment tool, not like many a times in patriarchal societies, women are denied, or women and children are denied devices, thinking they will corrupt them. While there's this we all saw post COVID, and not just education, there was a renewed focus on going cashless because of the nature of the disease. So, how can you tie it with empowerment instead of treating access to technology as a kind of, social patriarchal norms stopping that? You have to also frame that. So, to summarize, I think ultimately we need an all hands on deck approach that is culturally responsive and empowers local communities. My sense is by equipping them with the knowledge and the tools that they use, we can actually ensure there's greater digital literacy, and we can create a safer online space, which is also empowering.
Yeah, and I totally appreciate that intervention, because it touches on the criticality of responsible design practices really being baked into, not just the digital literacy programming, but also the tooling of the tech that we use. And so that makes me, to kind of look ahead, Nakshatra, makes me think that, we need to have more effective strategies for integrating that responsible design and those practices into the development and deployment of tech that we use. And these multi-stakeholder perspectives and multidisciplinary perspectives should be baked into that. What are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. And I agree with what Sudeshna had mentioned before as well, with adopting a proactive approach. And I'd like to add one more layer, and that's also the reactive. I feel like tech platforms do need both proactive and reactive, because as you said, by the time we discover something new with tech, another new issue has occurred. So we need to constantly prepare to have a solution or some sort of intermediary approach when something does happen. So to answer your question, Sandra, we definitely need a whole of society approach. What I've seen, jumping from my various career backgrounds, is that there is a disconnect between government, academia, and startups or the tech industry, where people are providing solutions here. And because there's a disconnect between the information and the translation between these industries, people are in different industries trying to tackle the same problem, which means that there is no regulation, like appropriate regulation provided for particular types of crime. And multiple people are trying to solve the same problem without everyone having a seat at the same table and asking to solve the same problem. So the safety by design principles that the Australian E-Safety Commission has put out is a very good example of how to embed those principles in whatever work that you're trying to do. I also think that because if you adopt that in a proactive sense, whether you're building a new solution or a new product for individuals or users of your community, you need to also ensure that that is a continuous approach. So while through like audits, reviews, having consultants continually assess the effectiveness of the approach that you have, it can't just be at the beginning of the approach that you have for your product. Like, yes, okay, tick and flick. We've completed all the requirements based on creating a community guideline that is intersectional, that is feminist, that includes and caters to the needs of our audiences and our users. It has to be continuous. It has to occur every single time, like whatever the time frame or the period that is required for your product. I feel the product life cycle for tech products especially, a lot of people place focus on whether it meets the needs of the users and the consumers from whatever problem that they're trying to solve, versus this online gender-based violence and the possibility of it perpetrating or causing mental health and well-being issues and psychosocial issues for the users themselves. So that is another lens that individuals who are creating products or tech platforms or anyone who engages with platforms needs to look at. And another thing that just came to mind is the mental health and well-being of trust and safety teams and content moderators. And that is something that if you are creating a product and you do have a trust and safety team, or you're looking to have content moderators or anyone who deals with harmful and abusive content, ensuring their mental health and well-being is paramount, because their biases will play into it, any sort of situation or circumstance that does arise. And it's really important that we don't perceive them as just screeners and tools. They're all human beings that are viewing this content, and their mental health and well-being needs to be paramount as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate you naming that. I think to kind of round out our conversation and, bring something back to the audience that they could walk away with, I would love to know from all three panelists quickly, as we're coming at time, what is a way tomorrow that we could be reflective of International Women's Day and be reflective, but also celebrate the intersectional identities that play a role in what we see today as the combating of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. Hera, I'll start with you if that's okay.
I would say is to have an open mind, listen, learn, don't assume, and I really believe is that we should tear down any personas that we have made on layers and layers of assumptions. So just have an open mind and know that people may experience the same thing differently, even though there's a shared global experience.
Sudeshna, Nakshatra.
Sure, I can go next. My only humble request is, it's International Women's Day Eve here in the US, and we are supposed to hold half the sky. And I love this phrase that women hold half the sky, but do we really? Is my question. And in tech, can we have equal representation? We do need, when these tools are being designed, where are we in the decision-making process? I was reading this morning that typically in this AI revolution, it's the male startups, co-founded startups, which are getting majority of the funding. So they are getting wealthier. when you read these kind of headlines, they're not just clickbaits, but they remind you that we still are treated as lesser being, as second-class citizen in a world where we are supposed to hold half the sky. So I would just leave at that.
I'd just like to jump off the back of both Hera and Sudeshna and say that, you know, it's International Women's Day here in Australia. So happy International Women's Day, everyone. And in the interest of not sounding like a cliche, I feel like every day should be International Women's Day. But I feel as though there are two things. If you have the ability to listen to the women and the non-binary folks in your life, then that should be your priority for tomorrow. And if you have the ability to elevate their voices, not everyone does have that ability, but you have the ability to elevate their voices, whether it's sharing or resharing a post that they might have that they're talking about their experiences, or having opportunities like this where you can have forums and open chats. I would highly recommend that. Those are my two tips.
Hera, Nakshatra, Sudeshna, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I'm honored to have been able to lead this conversation with you all, and looking forward to future such conversations. And to the folks that are watching today, please keep in touch with us, alltechishuman.org. Check out our newsletter, check out our LinkedIn. We have a lot of great programming coming up for you. We want to hear from you. We want to get you involved. So please reach out, say hello, and looking forward to working with you all.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and colleagues, and Hera and Nakshatra. Happy International Women's Day to everyone. Thank you.
Happy International Women's Day.